Today I'm bringing you something a bit different. A comparison video between two ascendancies playing the same build, with nearly identical gear, minus a couple jewels being a bit different. On putting this character together and testing it out in different scenarios, I've been very happy with the results. Since the results have been so good, it makes me want to min-max and tweak the character so I can confidently recommend you the best possible version of the build I can make. In my opinion, the two strongest choices for in-stacking Wander are Deadeye and Scion Ascendant. Other strong options like Assassin and Occultist exist, but I believe they are outclassed in power by Deadeye and Scion, so I'm not going over those. I couldn't make up my mind which of these two I'd prefer to recommend, so I went ahead and I leveled the Scion to test them against each other. The first big difference is the far shot versus the point blank playstyle. You'll notice in all the Scion clips, I'm trying to be up close and personal to maximize my DPS, while the Deadeye variant, I'm doing the exact opposite in trying to maintain some distance. Between these two playstyles, I generally prefer point blank playstyle as it's easier to position my Hydrosphere, a bit more consistent on the damage, and it leads to an easier time dodging boss mechanics for me personally. That being said, there's something oddly satisfying about deleting a boss from almost off the screen, along with the beautiful spikes of damage you get as a reward for perfect distance positioning. You can feel it and it's oh so satisfying. Besides the playstyle difference, there are a few offensive and defensive differences as well. Scion ends up being a bit more defensive with a bit higher ES pool, as well as snagging Wind Dancer for a nice 20% damage reduction on the occasional boss hit that lands, and also getting permanent stun immunity thanks to the Occultist sub-ascendancies. It also has a few minor boosts like 10% attack dodge from Raider and permanent phasing for some quality of life. While Scion takes the defensive W, Deadeye snags a win in offensive power. Although a bit less consistent, as it depends on positioning to maximize far shot damage, this ends up being a non-issue. With some practice playing the character, I believe the positioning will become somewhat second nature. I also can confirm through some testing I did that far shot damage is getting utilized on both our initial hit and the returning projectile. My test was to use the fledgling unique helm, which somebody suggested in the comments of my last video, which states projectiles can't collide with enemies in close distance. I then set up two scenarios. One scenario where I would attack an enemy at close range, hitting my Hydrosphere far away. On this test, I registered one hit from the returning projectile, which proved to me that the distance for the fledgling unique was highly dependent on the distance the projectile traveled and not my own distance. Next, I tested shooting a monster at far range with the Hydrosphere on top of the monster. This registered 2 hits, which means the returning projectile from Vengeance Cascade was still considered having traveled a far distance and didn't have its travel distance restarted on the returning projectile, which means we'd be getting full benefit from far shot damage, which is a good thing. Another key difference between the two is I ultimately enjoyed the clear of Deadeye more than Scion. Between the additional far shot damage, which felt better for clear, along with extra projectiles coming out of Sniper's Mark when you put that on enemies through Spellslinger, and the extra projectiles from Deadeye in the KB setup, the clear just felt noticeably different and better on the Deadeye. Besides those overarching differences, there are a few discrepancies in this test that I should go over to give you a more full picture to help you decide between the two. 1. Scion uses an unnatural instinct. This is a sizable upgrade and should be considered if you're on a budget. This isn't something you would need on a Deadeye and gives a sizable cost difference there. 2. Scion could have an additional 10 penetration on the boot enchant for single target on bosses, which it doesn't have in this video as I didn't want to re-enchant my boots, as a Deadeye requires the stun enchant plus 20% stun on a jewel implicit to get stun immunity while mapping. And 3. Scion could receive further powerful upgrades if you have the currency with things like getting a Tailwind on your boot suffix, whereas this is not an option for Deadeye as you already have Tailwind from your ascendancies. Of course, this would add a massive cost to the boot craft, but it's something to consider as well if you have a lot of currency to min-max. And technically the Scion in this test had one additional level over the Deadeye, and that's just one passive point difference. I didn't feel like leveling my Deadeye one more time to do the test. Anyways, there are probably a few minor differences I'm spacing on, but these are the main ones between the almost identical setups. All in all, between the two, I believe I ultimately prefer my original pick of the Deadeye. The clear just adds an extra layer of fun to the build over Scion in my opinion, and Deadeye also operates on a tighter budget, not utilizing things like unnatural instinct, and I appreciate that aspect as well. They're both very, very strong choices, and I would ultimately pick which one based on your own personal preference, not on necessarily what I recommend here, as you might prefer a more defensive style of the Scion, or you might prefer the Deadeye for more deeps. You know, it's up to you. At a fairly similar power level, they just have a few key differences. I fully plan to make a fleshed out guide on this character due to all the positive feedback I had on the Righteous Fire build guide I did where I put more effort into the path of building. It makes me want to elevate my own standards for guides I put out going forward. Because of this, I will be working on a more budget variant of this build in an attempt to find the breaking point of how low the initial cost of an in-stacking wander can be, as well as give my own guide more detail for progressing your own gear from the bare minimum of what makes the build work all the way to the maximum of destroying content. I have heard countless times you can't do an instacker unless you have X amount of currency, and I want to see how low we can push that X currency amount. So that is what I will be working on next for the character before putting out a full guide. As always, thank you all for watching. Stay sane, Exiles.